There's a movement afoot to position the press as some sort of unassailable democratic institution, and therefore any time any of its pronouncements are challenged, this represents an attack at the very heart of democracy itself. The press likes to take on this white knight role. It's the fourth estate, it's the institution that speaks truth to power, and yet it never seems to realize that it itself is a very prominent social power, which carries at least as much weight as government organs. And perhaps it carries even more weight because government is nominally bounded to a truncated sphere, whereas the free press has a great deal more power to intrusively meddle into our private affairs. And there's a weird disassociation between journalists who talk very seriously about the role of social media and the role that they play in carrying out a public dialogue, and how if they're not fair, if they're not balanced, if hate speech is allowed to be present on social media institutions, that this represents some sort of threat to the quality of free press, that this degrades democracy somehow, but they seem unable to recognize that they themselves play the same sort of role. Whereas social media is open to questioning and regulation, the free press itself, the actual journalistic institutions that are enshrined supposedly by the First Amendment, are completely shielded from the same criticism as social media, which is not journalism proper per se. There's this question here, right, of who's watching the watchman. And this idea that attacks on the free press, or stopping short of that, partisan attacks on the quality of the job or on the motives of particular journalists, this idea that scrutiny of the press and questioning of its conclusions, particularly by government officials, is antithetical to the First Amendment. This is an interesting idea, and it's one that doesn't really hold up with constitutional theory, even though this is where it's getting its basis. Because the constitutional argument for freedom of the press as a hallowed democratic institution that can't be challenged without degrading democracy doesn't really work, because it ignores the free speech clause of the First Amendment. Yes, the press is protected, but so is literally every other member of the polity, whose opinion is protected by the freedom of speech. Now, there's a difference here between freedom of speech and freedom to be heard, because the First Amendment does not mean that any one agency or another is obliged to provide balance or to give due consideration to all viewpoints. If the press wants to be hyperpartisan, if it wants to wage an out-and-out war on the Trump administration, it absolutely has the right to do so. And people who do not like this, or people who support this, alternately, are free to exercise the judgment of their purchasing power, because remember, the media is driven by ratings, so consumers have an important role to play. And these are all really legitimate courses of action. And taking a little bit of a sidestep and wading into the Alex Jones controversy for a minute, private organizations are also not required to give credence to a particular viewpoint, even if they swaddle themselves in First Amendment language, as platforms like Facebook and Twitter are wont to do, even though their actions don't really live up to the principles they're espousing. Imagine Alex Jones as a more traditional journalist, and instead of ranting on obscure corners of the internet, he makes a living as an op-ed writer. No opinion editor in the country has a duty to print his insane rantings. The editor, who is ultimately responsible for cultivating their page, has a right to exercise their discretion and to not print something that he or she thinks meets a certain standard. Right? I used to be an opinion editor. These are decisions I used to make all the time. And that's still freedom of the press. Facebook might be a different medium, it might be a newer medium, but the same principles still apply. So it's not censorship to refuse to print someone's opinion. But let's get back to journalism proper in the First Amendment, because hidden in the Jones imbroglio is an interesting point about objectivity. Journalists try to use First Amendment press freedoms to imbue themselves with a certain sense of objectivity, thus insulating them from criticism and positioning anyone who attacks them or anyone who denigrates them as some sort of partisan, disinterested, really disingenuous actor. It allows them to try and take the moral ground and to automatically position anyone who challenges them as suspect. But the truth is, the press has never really been objective, and it's worth questioning whether this was even in the minds of those who were writing the First Amendment. Because remember, when the Constitution was written, and yes, the Bill of Rights comes a few years after the Constitution, but when the Constitution was written, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, the authors of the Federalist Papers, effectively weaponized the press to try and sell the case for ratification of the Constitution. They turned prominent newspapers into their own little propaganda machines and published their Federalist Papers in prominent newspapers as a way to try and bring people, both the public and the members of the ratifying convention, around to their ways of thinking and belabor them into voting for ratification. And ultimately, this is what gets lost in modern day arguments about free speech and freedom of the press. We as Americans put so much stock in freedom of speech and in freedom of information and the free flow of ideas, and these are all good things, but sometimes, because we're so invested in these ideas, they become a law unto themselves. There's this assumption that anything that's put into print is automatically convincing on its merits because the press is imbued with such trust as a social institution in our country. And perhaps because of the objectivity that the press wraps around itself like a mantle, we have this idea that anything that is put in print is automatically convincing, it automatically holds sway over how people behave and can strike at the very heart of government itself. But people are free thinkers and independent actors. Ultimately, it's up to the individual to decide for his or herself what information and what sources are credible. Media does not have some sort of hypnotic mind control power. If you believe the extreme and ridiculous messages that are posted by partisan actors on Facebook, whether these be special interest groups in the United States or whether these be Russian bots in upcoming elections, it's likely, if you believe that sort of disinformation, that you are predisposed to that message to begin with. Or you're just not willing to engage analytically. And that's not the fault of the media. That's a personal failing, and there is no regulation that can solve that. The best words of wisdom when it comes to the freedom of the press, the freedom of speech questions we're facing with today, I think come from Thomas Jefferson, who himself was the target of multiple vicious smear campaigns by the press. James T. Callender, a spurned devotee of Thomas Jefferson, took to the pages of his own newspaper to run a campaign against the president after Jefferson refused to give him a job in his presidential administration on the basis of Callender's past loyalty. Jefferson considered it to be nepotism, Callender considered it to be disloyalty, and so he turned against Jefferson. It was Callender who popularized the rumors about Jefferson's affair with his slave Sally Hemings, a myth that still persists today despite known historical inaccuracies in what Callender was stating at the time, and a complete lack of physical evidence that proved that Jefferson fathered any of Sally Hemings' children. So this is a man who understood firsthand what it was like to be smeared by the press. But despite being viciously libeled, Jefferson was vehemently against cracking down on the press. In his second inaugural address, he pronounced emphatically that a partisan press was no match for the rationality of the American people. Quote, he says, "Since truth and reason have maintained their ground against false opinion in league with false facts, the press, confined to truth, needs no other legal restraint. The public judgment will correct false reasonings and opinions, on a full hearing of all parties, and no other definite line can be drawn between the inestimable liberty of the press and its demoralizing licentiousness. If there be still improprieties which this rule would not restrain, its supplement must be sought in the censorship of public opinion."